I want you to imagine a very specific kind of discomfort, not a sharp, sudden pain, like the breaking of a bone or the searing of a flame, not the grand, theatrical agony we often associate with the darker chapters of history. No, this is something quieter, more insidious. It's a discomfort that lives in the space between moments. It's the feeling of an itch you can never scratch, a stone in your shoe you can never remove. It's the exhaustion of a sleepless night, stretched into days, then weeks. It is the weight of your own head, a weight you never notice until you are forbidden from resting it. Imagine you are sitting in a cold, damp cell. The air is heavy with the smell of mold and despair. Your hands are bound, but that's the least of your worries. The real source of your misery is a simple device strapped around your neck. It's a leather collar, and attached to it is a short, rigid bar of iron. At each end of this bar, two brutally sharp tines curve outwards, like a pair of twin fangs. One set of these tines is pressed firmly against the hollow of your throat, just above your breastbone. The other set is nestled directly under your chin, the points digging into the soft flesh beneath your jaw. Your head is forced into an unnaturally upright position. You cannot look down. If you do, the lower tines will pierce your chest. You cannot let your head droop forward, even for a second, as the exhaustion consumes you. If you do, the upper tines will drive themselves into your jaw and throat. You cannot rest. You cannot sleep. You cannot even bow your head in a moment of prayer or surrender. You are trapped in a state of perpetual, agonizing alertness. Every muscle in your neck and shoulders screams in protest. The simple, biological need for your body to relax, to succumb to gravity, has been turned into a weapon against you. This instrument, elegant in its simplicity and profound in its cruelty, has a name. It's called the heretic's fork, and often, etched into its cold iron surface, were two simple Latin words, a promise and a prophecy. Confiteor, I confess. Today we are not exploring the loud, bloody theater of public execution. We are descending into the quiet, suffocating world of the interrogation chamber. We will examine a tool that was not designed to break the body, but to systematically dismantle the mind. The heretic's fork is more than just a forgotten artifact of the Spanish Inquisition. It is a masterclass in psychological warfare. It represents a chillingly sophisticated understanding of how to use a human being's own physical needs for rest, for comfort, for a moment's peace as the very engine of their destruction. This is the story of how eternal discomfort was engineered to produce a confession, and how the path to salvation was paved with the unbearable agony of being eternally awake. It's a journey into the heart of a system where the silence was more terrifying than the screams, and where the most effective tool of torture was the one that simply never, ever let you rest. To understand the heretic's fork, we must first understand the world that created it. This was not an instrument of random cruelty. It was a product of a specific time, a specific place, and a terrifyingly logical, if profoundly alien, worldview. We must step into the mind of the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, an era when faith was not a private matter but the very bedrock of reality, the organizing principle of society, politics, and the cosmos itself. In this world, heresy was not merely a difference of opinion. It was a spiritual plague. A heretic was not just someone who was wrong. They were a source of cosmic contamination, a diseased cell in the body of Christ that threatened to infect and damn the entire community. Their ideas were a direct assault on God's established order, and allowing them to fester was to invite divine wrath, social chaos, and eternal damnation for all. The stakes could not have been higher. From this fertile ground of spiritual anxiety grew one of history's most infamous institutions, the Tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition, most notoriously the Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478 by the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. Its stated purpose was to maintain Catholic orthodoxy, to root out heresy, and ensure the limpeza de sangre purity of blood. Its primary targets were conversos Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of practicing their former faiths in secret. Later, its purview would expand to include Protestants, supposed witches, blasphemers, and anyone who deviated from the strict dogma of the Church. The Inquisition operated under a legal framework that seems perverse to the modern mind. Its goal was not primarily to punish, but to save. The Inquisitor was not just a prosecutor. He saw himself as a physician of the soul. The heretic's soul was sick, and the only cure was a full, heartfelt confession, followed by repentance and reconciliation with the Church. Without a confession, the soul could not be saved. And here we arrive at the central, terrible paradox of the Inquisition. A confession was absolutely necessary, but for it to be valid, it had to be given freely. A confession extracted directly by pain was, in theory, worthless. This created a legal and theological problem. How do you get a stubborn heretic who denies their guilt to confess willingly? The answer was a grim exercise in semantics. Torture el tormento is officially not a punishment. It was a tool to encourage the accused, to help them break through their denial and speak the truth that was locked inside them. The physical pressure was meant to help them achieve spiritual clarity. The session of torture was known as the question, and the instruments used were designed, at least in theory, to achieve this end with a kind of horrifying precision. This is the world that gives birth to the heretic's fork. It exists within this gray area of encouragement. When you look at the more famous tools of the Spanish Inquisition, like the strapado, which dislocated the shoulders, the water cure, a form of waterboarding, or the rack, which stretched the body, they were designed to inflict overwhelming, acute pain. They were rituals of agony, designed to produce a scream, a breaking point, a desperate plea for the pain to stop. The heretic's fork, however, operates on a different principle entirely. It is a masterpiece of what we might call low-intensity, long-duration torture. Its genius, from the Inquisitor's perspective, lay in its subtlety. It didn't crush bones. It didn't tear ligaments. On the surface, it did very little. A man could be placed in the fork and left in his cell. To a casual observer, he is simply being held in an uncomfortable posture. This allowed the Inquisitors to maintain the legal fiction that the prisoner was not being actively tortured in the same way as someone on the rack. He was simply in a state of heightened questioning, a period of reflection and penance, but the reality for the victim was a slow, grinding descent into madness. The device's primary function was the complete and total abolition of rest. Let's break down its mechanics of misery. First, and most obviously, is the prevention of sleep. Sleep is not a luxury. It is a fundamental biological necessity. Without it, the human mind and body begin to break down in predictable, catastrophic ways. After 24 hours without sleep, cognitive function is already impaired. After 48 to 72 hours, the victim enters a state of profound psychological distress. They experience microsleeps, brief, uncontrollable lapses into unconsciousness lasting a few seconds. For a victim in the heretic's fork, each microsleep would be met with a jolt of sharp pain as their head nodded, driving the tines into their flesh. The very mechanism the brain uses to save itself becomes a source of repeated agony. Prolonged sleep deprivation leads to paranoia, hallucinations, and a complete loss of the ability to think rationally. The walls of the cell might seem to breathe. Whispers might echo in the silence. The victim's own thoughts become a tangled, unreliable mess. Their perception of time dissolves. Is it day or night? Have they been here for hours or for weeks? The very foundations of their reality begin to crumble. Second is the physical torment. The constant strain on the neck, shoulder, and back muscles would be immense. It would start as a dull ache and graduate to a relentless, burning agony. The body is not designed to hold such a rigid, tense posture indefinitely. Every muscle fiber would be screaming for relief, but relief is impossible. The simple act of swallowing would become a conscious, painful effort, the tines scraping against the throat. Third is the psychological humiliation. The posture forced by the heretic's fork is one of pride and arrogance. The head is held high, the gaze forced forward. The victim cannot bow their head in submission, in prayer, or in shame. They are frozen in a mask of defiance. To the inquisitors, this would be interpreted as proof of the heretic's stubborn pride, their refusal to humble themselves before God and his representatives. The device physically manifests the very synpritithat they are being accused of. It turns the victim's body into a tableau of their own supposed guilt. This is a profound form of psychological manipulation. The victim is not only in pain, but is also forced to look the part of the unrepentant sinner, reinforcing the narrative of their own damnation. And finally, there's the inscription, Confiteor, I confess. Imagine staring down, your eyes catching the glint of those words on the iron bar just below your chin. It's the only thing you can clearly see. The words are a constant suggestion, a command, a prophecy. They are the only way out. The device itself tells you what you must do to make the suffering stop. It is a self-fulfilling instrument. It doesn't ask a question. It provides the answer. The heretic's fork, then, was not just a piece of hardware. It was a meticulously designed system for psychological deconstruction. It used the body's own needs against it, turning sleep into pain, posture into proof of guilt, and silence into a breeding ground for madness. It was a quiet, patient monster, content to wait while the victim's own mind did most of the work. Let us now step into the chamber itself. Let's imagine the process, the grim theater that unfolded around this simple, terrible instrument. The victim of the heretic's fork was not simply thrown into a cell and forgotten. They were a player in a carefully scripted drama of interrogation. A drama designed to lead to one and only one conclusion: confession. The process often began with the arrest, which was itself a psychological shock. Inquisitorial agents would typically arrive at night, suddenly and without warning. The accused would be taken from their home, separated from their family, and plunged into the secret, labyrinthine world of the Inquisition's prisons. This initial act of dislocation was designed to terrify and disorient. Once in the cell, the accused would be left alone, often for days or weeks, with no knowledge of the specific charges against them or the identity of their accusers. This period of isolation was crucial. It allowed fear and uncertainty to fester. The silence of the prison was a form of pressure in itself. At some point, the formal interrogations would begin. The accused would be brought before a tribunal of inquisitors. These were not wild-eyed sadists. They were often highly educated men, theologians and lawyers, who saw their work as a solemn, sacred duty. The chamber would be arranged to maximize their authority. They would be seated on a raised platform, clad in the robes of their office, while the accused stood or knelt before them. The questioning would be circular, repetitive, and leading. Do you know why you are here? Do you have any enemies who might wish to slander you? Search your conscience. What sins have you committed against God and His holy church? If the accused denied any wrongdoing, the pressure would escalate. They might be shown the instruments of torture. This was a formal step in the process, the territio. The mere sight of the rack, the strappado, or the heretic's fork was often enough to break a person's will. The executioner would explain in calm, methodical detail exactly what each instrument did. This was not a threat. It was presented as a sad necessity, a path they would be forced to take if the accused continued in their stubborn refusal to confess. If the accused still held out, they would be sentenced to the question. And it is here that the unique horror of the heretic's fork comes into play. While more dramatic tortures were often used for specific sessions, the fork was perfectly suited for the long periods in between. It was the background noise of agony, the constant pressure that worked on the victim even when the inquisitors were not present. Imagine the cycle. The victim spends days in their cell wearing the fork. They are in a state of constant pain and mounting sleep deprivation. Their mind is starting to unravel. Then they are brought back to the interrogation chamber. The fork is removed. This moment of relief is itself a powerful tool of manipulation. For the first time in days, the victim can lower their head, relax their screaming muscles. The sudden absence of pain is a feeling of pure bliss, an intoxicating release. In this moment of vulnerability, the inquisitor, who just minutes before was the source of their torment, now becomes the source of their relief. He might offer them a sip of water, a piece of bread. He might speak to them in a gentle, paternal voice. "My child," he might say, "why do you force us to do this? We do not wish to see you suffer. We only wish to save your soul. Confess, and this can all be over. Confess, and you can rest." This is a classic interrogation technique, creating a dependency between the victim and their abuser. The inquisitor presents himself as the only escape from the hell he himself has created. The victim, their rational mind shattered by lack of sleep and constant pain, begins to see the inquisitor not as an enemy, but as a potential savior. If they still refuse to confess, the fork is strapped back on, and they are returned to their cell. The cycle begins again. The bliss of relief is replaced by the renewed agony, now made even more unbearable by the memory of its absence. Each cycle grinds them down further. The hallucinations become more vivid. The paranoia deepens. They begin to lose track of what is real and what is a product of their tortured mind. Did they actually commit heresy? In the fog of exhaustion, they might no longer be sure. The lines blur. The will to resist erodes, not in a single snap, but grain by grain. The psychology of a coerced confession is a well-understood phenomenon. A person subjected to this kind of relentless physical and mental pressure will eventually do or say anything to make it stop. It is not a matter of courage or cowardice. It is a matter of basic human physiology. The confession becomes a rational choice, the only rational choice left in a world that has been stripped of all reason. And so, the victim confesses. They might confess to anything and everything the inquisitors suggest. They might name their friends and neighbors as fellow heretics, desperate to provide the kind of detailed confession that will satisfy their tormentors. The words etched on the fork confiteorhave become their reality. But the tragedy is that the confession was rarely the end of the ordeal. It was merely the gateway to the next stage. A reconciled heretic, having confessed, would still have to face punishment. Their property would be confiscated. They might be sentenced to years of public penance, forced to wear a humiliating garment called a sanbenito. They might face life imprisonment. And for those whose heresy was deemed particularly severe, the confession merely granted them a small mercy in death. Instead of being burned alive at the stake in the grand public spectacle of the auto da fe, they would be mercifully garroted strangled to death before their body was consigned to the flames. The heretic's fork, therefore, was not a tool for discovering the truth. It was a tool for producing a pre-written script. It was an instrument designed to make a human being beg for the privilege of their own conviction. Its purpose was not to make the guilty speak, but to make an innocent person believe in their own guilt, or, at the very least, to say the words that would bring the blessed, final relief of oblivion. It was the quiet, methodical engine at the heart of a system that valued the performance of justice far more than justice itself. Like all instruments born of a specific historical moment, the Heretic's Fork eventually faded into obscurity. The world that had created it, a world of absolute spiritual certainty and institutionalized religious persecution, began to change. The fires of the Inquisition, which had burned for centuries, slowly died out. The decline was driven by the seismic shifts in Western thought that we call the Enlightenment. A new emphasis on reason, individual rights, and religious tolerance began to challenge the very foundations of the inquisitorial worldview. Philosophers like Voltaire and Cesare Beccaria launched scathing critiques of torture and secret tribunals. Beccaria's 1/764 treatise, On Crimes and Punishments, was a landmark text, arguing that torture was not only barbaric but also irrational, as it produced false confessions and punished the weak while the strong might resist. The idea that a confession had to be freely given was exposed as the cruel legal fiction it had always been. The power of the Church to enforce its dogma through state-sponsored violence waned. The Spanish Inquisition was finally, officially, abolished in 1834. The Heretic's Fork, along with the rack, the strappado, and the other grim tools of the Question, became relics of a dark past, objects to be displayed in museums as grim curiosities, testaments to a cruelty we believed we had outgrown. But have we? The metal and leather of the Heretic's Fork may be confined to glass cases, but the principles behind it have proven remarkably resilient. The fork's true horror lies not in its sharp points, but in its sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation. And that is a knowledge that has not been forgotten. Its legacy is not found in its physical form, but in the echoes of its methods that we can still see and hear in the modern world. The core principle of the Heretic's Fork is the use of prolonged, low-intensity suffering to break an individual's will. It's about creating a state of despair so profound that confession or compliance becomes the only viable path. This principle is the foundation of many modern, enhanced interrogation techniques. Consider the use of stress positions, where detainees are forced to hold physically excruciating postures for hours or days on end. This is the Heretic's Fork without the fork. It uses the body's own weight and muscle fatigue as the instrument of torture. The goal is the same: to inflict grinding, relentless discomfort that bypasses the obvious signs of brutality while systematically breaking the subject down. Consider the use of sleep deprivation, a cornerstone of modern psychological coercion. Detainees are kept awake for days at a time, often using sensory overload, blaring music, constant light-o prevent rest. As we've explored, the effects are devastating: paranoia, hallucinations, the collapse of rational thought. This is precisely the mental state the Heretic's Fork was designed to induce. It's a method for making the mind an unreliable narrator of its own experience, making it pliable and open to suggestion. The legal and ethical debates surrounding these techniques today echo the twisted logic of the Inquisition. Proponents often argue that these methods do not constitute torture in the classic sense, that they are necessary for national security, and that they are designed to encourage a detainee to reveal vital information. It is the same semantic dance, the same attempt to draw a line between acceptable pressure and unacceptable brutality, that the inquisitors themselves engaged in. The legacy of the Heretic's Fork also lives on in our understanding of coerced confessions. Legal systems around the world now recognize that confessions obtained under duress are inherently unreliable. And yet, the problem persists. The psychology of the interrogation room, even without physical instruments, can create immense pressure. Long hours of questioning, manipulative tactics, and the promise of going home, if you just cooperate, can lead innocent people to confess to crimes they did not commit, simply to make the ordeal stop. They are, in a sense, reaching for the relief promised by the inscription Confiteor. The story of this device is a powerful reminder that the most terrifying tools of oppression are not always the loudest or the bloodiest. The true genius of the Heretic's Fork was its silence, its patience. It weaponized the fundamental human need for rest. It understood that you don't need to break a person's bones if you can methodically unmake their mind. So when we look at the Heretic's Fork, we should see more than just a medieval torture instrument. We should see it as a symbol. It is a symbol of the terrifying power of quiet, relentless pressure. It is a symbol of how systems of power can create elaborate justifications for cruelty. And it is a cautionary tale about the enduring temptation to believe that the ends justify the means, especially when those means are applied in the shadows, far from public view. The dungeons of the Spanish Inquisition may be empty, but the psychological blueprint for the suffering they perfected remains. It serves as a stark warning that the battle against torture is not just about banning specific devices, but about recognizing and rejecting the insidious logic that allows us to turn a human being's own body and mind against them. The eternal discomfort of the Heretic's Fork is a ghost that still haunts the shadowy corners of our modern world, reminding us of the fragility of justice and the dark ingenuity of the human capacity for cruelty. Thank you for joining me in the quiet, desperate world of the interrogation chamber. The history of instruments like the Heretic's Fork is deeply unsettling, but it is by staring into this darkness that we can better appreciate the importance of light, reason, and justice. If you found this analysis of psychological coercion and the dark history of the Inquisition to be thought-provoking, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more explorations into the shadows of our past. Clicking the notification bell ensures you won't miss our next journey. But the most important part of this is the conversation that follows. The Heretic's Fork is a tool of the past, but are its principles still at play today? Where do you see the line between interrogation and torture? And what other quiet instruments of power, past or present, deserve to be brought into the light? Please share your insights and suggestions in the comments section below. Your thoughts are a vital part of what we do here. Thank you for listening.